My parents left me alone on Christmas to celebrate in Europe with my sister, came back demanding $25,000 for her wedding. Returning to my parents' house was a decision I never thought I'd make, let alone one I wanted to. But when the ink dried on the divorce papers, and the legal fees cleared out my savings, I was left with no other choice. My once steady life had crumbled, leaving me stripped of my pride, broke, and filled with a gnawing sense of failure. Moving back into my childhood bedroom felt like slipping into a cage where every corner reminded me of what I used to be. Worse yet, my parents didn't exactly make me feel welcome. My mom and dad had a way of masking disdain with politeness, a skill they had honed over the years. Their affection, or what passed for it, was reserved for my younger sister, Jessica. Jessica had always been the golden child, the star student, the beauty pageant winner, the one who could do no wrong. The moment I walked through the door with my bags, the atmosphere shifted. My mom offered a tight smile before retreating to the kitchen. My dad mumbled something about figuring it all out eventually before burying himself in the newspaper. Jessica's face lit up, not in excitement, but in smug satisfaction. Her eyes silently declared what my parents' words didn't need to: welcome home, failure. My room hadn't changed much since high school. The same posters hung on the walls, faded and curling at the edges. The bed was too small, the furniture scratched and outdated. It was a physical manifestation of the past I wanted to forget but now had to live in. The rest of the house, however, was a different story. Jessica's room looked like it belonged in a high-end magazine, all polished furniture and luxurious decor. My parents had spared no expense to make her comfortable while I was stuck feeling like a guest overstaying his welcome. Dinner conversations were a minefield. Every remark my parents made seemed like a veiled jab. They asked about my job search with a tone that dripped with skepticism, then pivoted to praise Jessica's latest achievements. She was working for some marketing firm and had just gotten a promotion, of course. I'd lost count of how many times they pointed out how well she was doing for someone her age. I nodded along, biting back the urge to remind them that I was also doing well once, until everything fell apart. The tipping point came a week before Christmas. I overheard Jessica gushing to my mom about their upcoming trip to France. My parents had planned a family vacation to Paris for the holidays, something they hadn't mentioned to me at all. When I asked about it later, my mom's response was as cold as the December air outside. She explained that they didn't think I'd want to go, considering my financial situation. My dad chimed in with a half-hearted apology that did little to mask his relief that I wasn't tagging along. Jessica, of course, couldn't resist twisting the knife, casually mentioning how nice it would be to have some time for just the three of us. So, they went. On Christmas Eve, I stood at the window, watching their car pull out of the driveway. My mom's parting words replayed in my head: "Make the best of it, Michael." It wasn't advice. It was a command. I tried to salvage what I could of the holiday. I ordered takeout, Chinese, the only thing open, and queued up a few old movies. But the loneliness was suffocating. Every scroll through social media was a fresh wound. Pictures of my family smiling in front of the Eiffel Tower filled my feed, their captions a mix of festive cheer and subtle digs. "A magical Christmas with the best people," Jessica had written under one post. I turned off my phone, but the damage was done. I sat there, staring at the cold remnants of my dinner, feeling more isolated than I ever had before. The walls seemed to close in, the silence heavier than ever. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Why did they treat me this way? What had I done to deserve being pushed aside, made to feel like an outsider in my own family? The sense of rejection gnawed at me, but alongside it, something else began to stir: anger. Not the fiery, explosive kind, but a slow-burning ember that refused to die out. I wasn't just a failure in their eyes, I was invisible. And the more I thought about it, the more determined I became to change that. I didn't know how yet, but I wasn't going to let them write me off without a fight. As I stared into the dim glow of the television, the pieces of my resolve started to fall into place. If my family wanted to treat me like I didn't matter, then maybe it was time to show them exactly who they were overlooking. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of purpose. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me going. The question still lingered, haunting me as I lay awake that night: why had they given up on me? And what would it take to make them see me again? I didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was clear: I wasn't going to spend another Christmas like this. When my family returned from their trip, the house was instantly filled with the sounds of suitcases being dragged across the floor and their excited voices recounting every detail of their adventure. They talked over each other, giddy with memories of Parisian streets and candlelit dinners. My mom's tone was light, but there was a subtle edge to her words when she mentioned how unfortunate it was that I couldn't join them. My dad chimed in with a comment about how everything worked out for the best, a thinly veiled attempt to disguise their relief at my absence. Jessica's smirk said the rest. They barely asked about my Christmas. My mom's eyes lingered on the pile of takeout containers I hadn't yet thrown away, her lips pursed in judgment. Jessica walked past me without a word, her phone in hand, probably posting another round of photos from their trip. My dad gave me a curt nod before disappearing into his study. The message was clear: I was the afterthought, a loose thread in their otherwise perfect tapestry. A few days later, the reason for their sudden warmth toward me became apparent. My mom approached me in the kitchen, her voice syrupy and fake, asking how I was holding up. It didn't take long before she shifted the conversation to Jessica's upcoming wedding. She spoke about the venue and the guest list with the excitement of someone planning their own fairy tale, but then her tone grew serious. She explained that Tyler, Jessica's fiancé, was struggling to cover all the costs. Weddings, she reminded me, were expensive, and as a family, it was our duty to pitch in. She asked me for $25,000. The number hit me like a slap. I stared at her, stunned, barely able to process what she was saying. My mind raced. Did she seriously think I could afford that? Did she even remember why I was here in the first place? I reminded her of my financial situation, of the debt I was still crawling out of after the divorce. She waved it off, saying something about family coming first and a little sacrifice for Jessica's big day. When I refused, the shift in her demeanor was instant. The warmth vanished, replaced by an icy glare that could have frozen the sun. My dad joined in, his voice carrying the weight of disappointment. He called my refusal selfish, a betrayal of the family values they'd supposedly raised me with. Jessica's voice cut through the tension like a blade. She accused me of never supporting her, of always being absent when she needed me. The irony wasn't lost on me, but it stung nonetheless. The argument spiraled from there. Every grievance they'd ever held against me was laid bare, every mistake magnified under their collective scrutiny. My mom accused me of not trying hard enough to get back on my feet. My dad questioned my priorities, asking why I wasn't willing to help my sister when I had the chance to do something good. Jessica's contempt was the final straw. Her words dripped with disdain as she painted a picture of me as the selfish, bitter older brother who couldn't even put his pride aside for one day. By the time the shouting stopped, I was left standing in the kitchen, my hands gripping the counter to keep myself steady. The house was quiet again, but the air was thick with resentment. My heart pounded in my chest, anger and hurt mixing in a toxic brew that left me feeling hollow. It wasn't just about the money. It was about what I represented to them, a resource, not a person. An obligation, not a family member. Every word they had said confirmed what I had been trying to ignore for years: I wasn't part of their circle. I was orbiting around it, useful only when they needed something. For the first time, I began to question whether this dynamic was worth salvaging. I had spent my whole life trying to earn their approval, to prove that I was enough. But standing there in the aftermath of their accusations, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to before: I didn't want to be their punching bag anymore. If they couldn't see me as more than a means to an end, then maybe it was time to stop playing the role they'd assigned me. That thought lingered as I retreated to my room, shutting the door against the world outside. I sat on the edge of my bed, the weight of their words pressing down on me. They wanted me to bend, to fold myself into the shape they needed, but I was done being malleable. The ember of anger from Christmas reignited, burning hotter now, fueled by a new determination. If they wanted a fight, I'd give them one. Not on their terms, but on mine. The question that loomed over me, though, was whether I could stand my ground when the time came. Could I really break free from the cycle of guilt and obligation they had built around me? Or would they pull me back in, like they always had? The answers felt just out of reach, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going to let them dictate my life any longer. The days following the argument were a haze of tension and hostility. My parents barely spoke to me, and when they did, their words were sharp and laced with judgment. Jessica avoided me altogether, except for the occasional smug glance that spoke volumes. The house, which had never felt like a sanctuary, now felt like enemy territory. Every moment was a reminder of how little I belonged there. It didn't take long for the demands to start again. My dad cornered me in the living room one evening, his expression grim. He talked about how the family had made sacrifices for me, how they'd taken me in when I had nowhere else to go. He reminded me of the meals I ate, the roof over my head, the bills I wasn't paying. It wasn't a conversation, it was an ultimatum. He wanted me to contribute financially to the household, on top of the $25,000 for Jessica's wedding. When I tried to explain my situation, he dismissed it, saying I needed to step up and stop being a burden. The pressure was relentless. My mom chimed in later, echoing his sentiments and adding her own guilt-laden twist. She talked about family loyalty, about how I was letting everyone down. Jessica, of course, seized every opportunity to twist the knife. She made snide comments about how I was always taking and never giving, how it was so typical of me to think only of myself. The walls felt like they were closing in, and I could feel my resolve slipping under the weight of their accusations. But something inside me refused to break. Their words hurt, yes, but they also fueled a growing determination to reclaim my life. I couldn't keep living like this, suffocating under their expectations and constant criticism. I needed to leave, even if it meant starting over from nothing. The decision to go wasn't easy. I had no job lined up, no savings to fall back on. The thought of stepping into the unknown was terrifying, but staying felt worse. I started packing my things in secret, not wanting to deal with their inevitable objections. It was a slow process, each item I placed in my bag a small step toward freedom. The breaking point came when Jessica confronted me in my room. She'd heard about my plans to leave and decided to make one last power play. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, holding my laptop in her hands. She claimed it as payment for the burden I'd placed on the family, saying she'd keep it until I reimbursed them for everything they'd done for me. Her voice dripped with entitlement, and her smug smile made my blood boil. I demanded she give it back, but she refused, taunting me with her supposed moral high ground. The argument escalated quickly, drawing my parents into the fray. They sided with Jessica, of course, accusing me of being ungrateful and irresponsible. My dad's voice was loud and filled with frustration, while my mom's tone was icy and dismissive. They painted me as a failure, a disappointment, someone who had squandered every opportunity they'd given me. Something inside me snapped. Years of resentment and hurt boiled to the surface, and I couldn't hold back anymore. I laid everything bare, every slight, every insult, every moment I'd felt overlooked and unwanted. I called out their favoritism toward Jessica, their complete disregard for my struggles, their constant need to make me feel less than. My voice shook with anger and emotion, but I didn't care. For the first time, I was saying what I'd held in for so long, and it felt both terrifying and liberating. They tried to interrupt, to deflect, but I wouldn't let them. I told them I was done being their scapegoat, done being the one they blamed for everything that went wrong. I made it clear that I wasn't going to let them control me anymore. When I finished, the room was silent, their stunned faces a mix of shock and anger. I grabbed my bags and walked out, leaving the laptop behind. It wasn't worth it. Nothing in that house was. As I stepped out into the cold night air, a strange mix of emotions washed over me. There was fear, of course, and uncertainty about what lay ahead. But there was also relief, a lightness I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I was free from their expectations, their manipulation, their constant judgment. I didn't know where I was going or what I would do next, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going back. The ties that had bound me to them were severed, and I was finally ready to start living on my own terms. The question now was whether I had the strength to build something new from the ashes of my old life. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I was determined to find them, one step at a time. The first night in my new apartment was both exhilarating and terrifying. It wasn't much, just a tiny studio with cracked paint on the walls and a single window that overlooked a noisy alleyway, but it was mine. For the first time in years, I felt like I had control over my life. No judgmental stares, no passive-aggressive remarks, no suffocating pressure to be someone I wasn't. Just silence, freedom, and the faint hum of the city outside. Settling in was a strange mix of relief and unease. The emptiness of the space mirrored the emptiness I felt inside, but it also held the promise of something new. I filled the apartment with second-hand furniture, a worn-out couch, a wobbly table, a mismatched set of plates, but every item felt like a step toward building a life that was finally my own. I spent hours arranging and rearranging, trying to make it feel like home. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. For once, I wasn't living up to anyone else's expectations. One of the first things I did was block my family on every platform. Social media, email, even their phone numbers. It wasn't an easy decision. Cutting them off felt like severing the last ties to my past, and a part of me wondered if I was overreacting. But every time I thought about their voices, their accusations, their constant manipulation, I knew it was the right choice. The relief was immediate, but it was tinged with sadness. Blocking them wasn't just about protecting myself, it was an acknowledgement that they weren't going to change. I couldn't keep hoping for a version of them that didn't exist. A few weeks passed in relative quiet. I threw myself into work, picking up extra shifts wherever I could. The money wasn't great, but it was enough to scrape by. I was exhausted most of the time, but it was a good kind of exhaustion. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving forward instead of treading water. Then, out of the blue, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Tyler. His voice was hesitant, almost apologetic, as he explained why he was calling. He said Jessica had told him about the $25,000 my parents demanded from me for their wedding, and he was appalled. Tyler admitted he didn't agree with how they had handled things and wanted to apologize for not speaking up sooner. He shared that he, too, had been under pressure from my family, their constant expectations weighing on him. I listened quietly, unsure of how to respond. Part of me wanted to lash out, to tell him it was too little, too late. But another part of me, the part that understood what it felt like to be trapped by their expectations, couldn't bring myself to blame him entirely. I told him I appreciated his apology but made it clear that I needed space. Tyler seemed to understand, and he didn't push. When the call ended, I felt a strange mix of emotions: sympathy, closure, and a lingering sadness for what could have been. Life slowly started to stabilize after that. I picked up a second job to make ends meet, and though the long hours were grueling, they were also rewarding. Every paycheck felt like a small victory, proof that I could stand on my own 2 feet. I started to set goals for myself, saving for a better apartment, taking a few online courses to improve my skills, even just treating myself to a decent meal once in a while. These weren't grand ambitions, but they were mine, and that made all the difference. The apartment, once a barren and unfamiliar space, began to feel like home. I hung a few cheap prints on the walls, bought a couple of plants to liven up the place, and started cooking for myself instead of relying on takeout. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. More than enough, really. For the first time, I wasn't living for anyone else. I was living for me. Still, there were moments of doubt, times when the loneliness crept in and made me question whether I'd made the right choice. But those moments were fleeting, and they always passed. Because deep down, I knew that this was the life I needed. It wasn't glamorous or easy, but it was honest. And for the first time in years, I felt free. As I sat on my couch one evening, sipping a cup of tea and listening to the sounds of the city outside, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. My family might never understand why I left, and they might never change, but that didn't matter anymore. This was my life, and I was finally ready to live it on my own terms. I didn't hear much about Jessica's wedding at first, but snippets started to reach me through mutual acquaintances. From what I gathered, it hadn't been the grand affair my parents had envisioned. Without the financial cushion they were hoping for, corners had to be cut. The guest list was smaller, the venue less glamorous, and the stress of it all seemed to take a toll. Even with their determination to make it perfect, the cracks were evident. A few months after the wedding, I heard the real shocker: Tyler had left Jessica. He'd apparently grown tired of the constant pressure from my family, the unrealistic expectations, and the manipulative dynamics. According to someone who'd spoken with him, Tyler felt like he was being pulled into a vortex of control and guilt, and he couldn't see a way out except to walk away. It was a bitter fallout that left Jessica devastated and my parents scrambling to pick up the pieces of their carefully constructed narrative. In the meantime, my parents' attempts to reach me escalated. They tried using friends and extended family to pass messages along, pleading for me to return their calls. The tone of their messages varied, sometimes apologetic, other times accusatory. They claimed they just wanted to talk, to make things right, but I knew better. It wasn't about reconciliation, it was about control. They were losing their grip, and they hated it. I ignored every attempt. Blocking them had been a difficult decision, but it was the right one. I wasn't going to let myself be pulled back into their web of manipulation. Eventually, their efforts slowed, and then stopped altogether. The silence that followed was both eerie and liberating. For the first time, I felt like I could truly move on without looking over my shoulder. My own life, in contrast, was beginning to thrive. I managed to land a better job, one that paid significantly more and allowed me to finally save some money. With a growing sense of stability, I upgraded to a nicer apartment, a small but comfortable one-bedroom with plenty of sunlight and a view of a nearby park. It felt like a reward for everything I'd endured, a physical manifestation of the progress I was making. As my financial situation improved, so did my confidence. I started setting bigger goals for myself and even took the leap to enroll in evening classes to develop new skills. Each step forward felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been buried under years of guilt and expectation. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was building something meaningful, something that belonged entirely to me. The emotional shift was perhaps the most surprising part. There were moments when memories of my family crept in, moments when I wondered if I'd done the right thing by cutting them off so completely. But those moments were fleeting, outweighed by the overwhelming sense of peace and freedom I now felt. I no longer carried the weight of their expectations, and that alone was worth everything I'd gone through. One evening, as I sat in my new apartment looking out at the city lights, I realized how far I'd come. The person I was now felt worlds apart from the one who had stood in that kitchen, grappling with years of pent-up resentment. I wasn't the perfect son they'd wanted, but I was finally the person I wanted to be. And that, I decided, was more than enough. About a year after I walked away, a letter arrived in my mailbox, its neat handwriting instantly recognizable. It was from Jessica. I stared at it for a long time before opening it, my mind racing through all the possibilities. When I finally unfolded the paper, the word surprised me. It was an apology, short, hesitant, but undeniably genuine. She admitted to her mistakes, acknowledged the way she and our parents had treated me, and said she wanted to make things right. She didn't offer excuses, just a simple acknowledgement that she'd been wrong and a hope that we could find a way to reconnect. I sat with the letter for hours, reading and rereading it. Part of me felt a flicker of warmth, a small, cautious hope that maybe things could change. But there was also a deep well of skepticism. After everything that had happened, after years of manipulation and disregard, how could I trust that this wasn't just another attempt to pull me back into their world? The fear of being hurt again loomed large, and I wasn't sure I was ready to take that risk. The days that followed were a blur of conflicting emotions. I thought about the good times Jessica and I had shared when we were younger, before the favoritism and resentment had driven us apart. I thought about her struggles, the failed wedding, the pressures she must have faced. But I also couldn't ignore the scars left by her words and actions, the way she had so easily dismissed my pain when it suited her. In the end, I decided not to respond, not yet, anyway. It wasn't a decision made out of spite, but out of a need for self-preservation. I needed time to process, to figure out what forgiveness would look like and whether it was even possible. For now, silence felt like the safest option, a way to protect the peace I had worked so hard to build. That peace had become the cornerstone of my life. My days were simple but fulfilling. I'd settled into a routine, balancing work and hobbies, building a small but meaningful circle of friends. My apartment, once a bare and lonely space, was now filled with life, books, plants, and the little touches that made it feel truly mine. It wasn't extravagant, but it was enough. More than enough. Looking back, I realized how much I had changed. The person I had been a year ago felt like a distant memory, someone weighed down by expectations and doubts that no longer held power over me. Breaking away from my family hadn't been easy, and the scars of those years would probably never fully fade. But they no longer defined me. I had found strength in setting boundaries, in choosing myself over the toxic dynamics that had once consumed me. As I folded Jessica's letter and tucked it away in a drawer, I felt a sense of closure. I didn't know if I would ever write back or if our relationship could be mended, but for the first time, that uncertainty didn't bother me. I had learned that family wasn't just about blood, it was about the people who uplifted you, who respected you, who made you feel whole. And sometimes, the hardest but most necessary choice was to walk away from those who couldn't. Now, my life is my own. It's not perfect, but it's free from the weight of their expectations. I've found joy in the small things, quiet mornings with a cup of coffee, evenings spent reading by the window, the laughter of friends who have become my chosen family. For the first time in years, I feel truly at peace. And that, I've realized, is worth everything.